let's talk a little bit about your journey, because you kind of talked about the snowballing effect. So what did you got into geckos? Maybe you could just let us know, kind of, was there a few species that grabbed your attention first, and how big did that collection end up kind of becoming?
Yeah, so when I first started, I kind of gravitated towards Sydney broadtail geckos just because they were a local species. Pardon me. And from there, I kind of discovered knobtail geckos.
Mm.
So that was kind of like a bit of a wormhole once I figured out that, there's a guy up the road an hour or a half away or whatever who had 100 of these things, and I could just go and pick them up at a will, sort of thing. So yeah, thanks, Rick. He kind of probably snowballed me really hard with that. So from there, I probably amassed. It was a modest collection to start with. I'd say probably wouldn't have peaked any more than, like, let's say 30 or 40 geckos, and then I kind of had like a few loose ends next to it where I might have like a few small pythons like Stimsons and Children's. I had a couple of bearded dragons. The kind of usual peripheral animals to maybe a project, if you wanted to call it that. But yeah, once I figured out how to breed knobtail geckos, that kind of got out of hand a little bit. I think I ended up with more geckos than, not that I could handle, but it was just, you almost were giving them away at one point because there was just so many of them there. And yeah, I think at the peak of my animal collection, if I want to call it that, I'd say it was about 170 odd animals. So modest by some people's standard, excessive to a lot of other people's standard. So I don't want to kind of get back to that number. I thought that was kind of getting a bit crazy.
Yeah. Is that in the same space you're in now?
No, so I've only been here for going on 3 years.
Okay.
Prior to this, I was in a space that was my in-laws' garage. So they basically had a double car garage and said, go nuts. And I did. And yeah, that's when I ended up with just everything from, turtles, geckos, frogs, snakes, monitors. Yeah, it was like a little reptile zoo down there.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's such a common story for folks in our hobby, is that it's so easy to get to that point, and then you hit kind of that tipping point where you realize, okay, this is too much. And so that's one of the areas that I really wanted to talk to you about, because you did a great video, and basically the less is more concept, and you can expand on that in a second. And it's something that we've talked about on the podcast before, and I think for many of the listeners, it's becoming a more unobvious thing to do to make sure that you don't let the collections grow. But I think with you, who's gone through that experience, we could probably give people some really good tools for analyzing yourself. Like, am I getting to that point? How do you know when you've got to that point? And then how do you actually get yourself, like, how do you back out of that situation ethically, which I think you probably did. So let's just discuss maybe your decision to sort of hit, like, was there a point where you're like, okay, this is way too much and I'm not enjoying this anymore? Or how did you navigate that?
To be honest, I think it was more so my hand was a little bit forced. So when I found out my wife was pregnant and I've got a 3-bedroom apartment with 2 bedrooms stacked to the gills with reptiles, I was like, where am I going to put my son? Like, where am I going to put my kid? Like, my kid has to live here too. And there was a good point there where pretty much before he was born, I started moving on a lot of my larger reptiles. There were quite a few of my larger reptiles. So I had like a mangrove monitor, I had an olive python, I had some diamond pythons, carpet pythons, things like that were, considerably sized animals by any apartment standards, really. And I think I kind of reached the point where I was like, well, can I give these larger animals a bigger space to enjoy themselves in, rather than kind of putting like I don't agree personally with like a carpet python in a 4x2x2 box. I think it's just not quite there. Yeah. I was kind of keeping, albeit 3 diamond pythons, I was keeping them in a 4x4x2 box, which is probably still too small for the amount of animals that were in it. And I was kind of looking at a few of these things and I was like, they're just too big, So they were kind of like the first group of animals, even though it was heartbreaking for me because I did love some of those animals a lot, to move on, just because I was like, well, they're too big. I can't offer them what I want to be able to offer them. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to focus on smaller animals and then give those smaller animals the space. And then that way I can kind of juggle it a little bit so I can still have a variety of animals and feel better about the space that they're in. So it's kind of like, making my conscience a little bit happier about a small lizard in a big box versus a snake in an adequate box. So yeah, that's kind of where it was. But yeah, it was kind of, I was already looking at a few of these things going, I don't know if this is right anymore. In particular, my mangrove monitor, although she was in a pretty decent size enclosure, I was always wanting to do more with her. But that particular junction in my life, I was like, I don't have the availability to do more with her now. So I made sure that she went on to somebody that was an aquarium builder by trade. And, he was planning this 10-foot long aquarium that was kind of 4 feet deep and 3 feet high, and like essentially a giant aquarium topper on top of that. And he's kind of sent me a few photos along the way and stuff like that of her like tearing into a full barramundi carcass and stuff like that. And I was like, well, these are all things that I couldn't do. Yeah. So that was kind of good to be able to make sure that a few of these animals went on to good homes. But yeah, that was probably one of the biggest decisions. And then kind of as my son came into the world and, my workload changed, my wife wasn't working, I had to pick up extra work. Then, the animals and my YouTube channel and stuff like that, I still consider that a little bit of an income because it does kind of help pay for the own hobby. But in saying that, I had to make sure that I was able to juggle everything. And by having excess animals while I was getting used to becoming a dad and working extra hours and just being totally exhausted, I still kind of had to downsize it a little bit just until I got that juggle sorted for myself and kind of my own mindset set into how I can run my day-to-day looking after everything well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it makes a lot of sense. And fortunately with something like a baby coming along, you're able to actually plan, like you basically have not quite a year, but say like 8 months to really renegotiate your space to make sure you're settled, where some people's lives can change overnight for whatever reason. And if you had those 170 animals in that situation, it becomes a lot more difficult to deal with. So I'm just, do you have any, like if you were to look at your collection, do you have any things that you would think that would be an indicator that you're too big? Like, is there anything that you would feel when you're caring for these 170 animals, like maybe you're not enjoying it as much, or like any indicators that I mean, like you said, yours hand was sort of forced, but I'm just trying to think if somebody is at home and they're thinking like, how would I know if my collection's too big? Is there anything that falls in that category?
Yeah, for sure. So like whilst my hand was forced, there was still a lot of those kind of thoughts creeping in at this time. And anyway, so I kind of got to the point where I was looking at it more as a chore than enjoyment. I was like, oh, I've got to go feed the snakes. Oh, I've got to go clean all the lizards. Oh, I've got to scrub all this glass. It was like those kind of like moments where you're like, it becomes a job and not fun. You're not kind of actually sitting down and enjoying your animals and watching behaviors and doing those things that you actually want to do. You're just kind of doing the bare minimum to get through. You're just chucking handfuls of crickets at the animals and walking away and leaving them to their day sort of thing. And it's when you kind of get to that point that I think you got to reassess and go, are you getting that day-to-day interaction with your animals that you want as a keeper? Because let's face it, we kind of all want like our own little private zoo that we can just enjoy, but you don't want that workload where you're getting burnt out and, it's causing you a lot of anguish. So yeah, I think it's being able to kind of recognize those differences in how you're keeping your animals. And it's not necessarily that you'll be like lacking in care for the actual animal. The animal will be getting what it needs, but if you're not enjoying it at the same time, then why are you doing it?
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
That's where you might go, hey, I just need to trim this a bit and just see what happens. Or, maybe get rid of some of the bigger stuff that you don't necessarily enjoy so much and, open it up to some space for something smaller to go into there. So it's a little bit less work, a little bit less poo, a little bit less food or electricity, there's so many factors involved.
Yeah, exactly. And one of the things that you'd mentioned in your video that was sort of the less is more kind of concept was lizard burnout. And I think that is, maybe I'll get you to expand on that. I mean, I think in some ways it hurts snakes because snakes are easier, so the care can actually be a lot worse because they can maybe be neglected a little bit more than a group of lizards. But I think some people probably don't realize how much more work lizards are compared to snakes, and how brutal that can be for you as a keeper.
Oh yeah, tenfold, I reckon. Like, I think that's why a lot of snake keepers can kind of have like 500-600 snakes and, probably manage them. I won't say necessarily they'll manage them well, but at the same time, there's nobody doing that with lizards. Or if you are, you're crazy and you're doing it full time, and you are burnt out and you just don't want to tell anybody about it. But for lizard keepers, like a snake that might feed once a fortnight generally means it's pooing once a fortnight. You can change your water bowl a couple of times a week or whatever, and that's kind of like your maintenance regime. But I don't feed my lizards a lot, but I still kind of try to feed them 3-4 times a week. And with 3-4 times a week worth of food, that means there's 3 or 4 times a week that there's poo. Lizards are pretty good at walking through water bowls and, running up glass and, just dirtying the whole enclosure pretty quick. So, yeah, I just say like the metabolic rate of a lizard versus something like a python, obviously they're two completely different animals. So you've got to be able to manage those two completely different types of care. Like I look at like my green tree pythons in their bioactive enclosures outside, and I'm like, this is easy.
Yeah.
I could do 100 of these and not blink. But, do I get that same sort of enjoyment out of that snake too? They're not on the same level as an interactive pet as like a small dwarf monitor, for example. So whilst I still find them interesting in their own right, they don't have that same sort of payout for the keeper, I don't think, if you want that little bit of extra interaction. So, but yeah, as far as lizard burnout, if you've got a lot of lizards, like it's a lot of mess. Like I had a friend, I'm not sure if you've had him on the podcast, but yeah, you probably should at some point. But Mitch Hodgson, he was probably one of the biggest gamid keepers in Australia for a number of years, and like his setup was insane. But the amount of workload that he had for himself, like I looked at it and I was like, he had probably the best gamid collection in Australia, like variety wise and everything. But I was like, this is going to burn hard and fast, because even me, as somebody that might have 20 lizards, looks at somebody like who's got 200 odd lizards and go, it's nuts. It's just nuts.
Yeah.
And sure enough, it kind of a couple of years roll around and he dipped his collection and just kind of found those little niches of what he wanted to keep. So him and I have kind of gone through almost that similar sort of pattern, but at the same time, just with different critters. So yeah, it's funny watching us all kind of go, oh, we're going through a downsize again. We just need to trim down the collection a little bit. And, hey, do you want this? It becomes kind of like a trading point sort of thing between the inner circle, should I call it?
Yeah.
But yeah, we all dip and fade through it.
Exactly. And so that was going to be my second question, or whatever question we're on about this, is like, what are some tips that you recommend for people for downsizing? I mean, the easiest thing is just throwing everything up online, but clearly most people want to, like you said, you have an attachment to these animals. You went out, you bought them, maybe you went to the expo, you had a few good years with them, and now you're kind of growing to the point where you think maybe this isn't the animal for me, but you still don't want the animal to end up in the wrong hands. So how do you ethically downsize where you can actually feel good about the fact that the animals are not being in worse hands?